Okay, today begins our two-part series on the reliability of the New Testament. Today what we're going to be talking about is the reliability of the New Testament. How do we know that the New Testament is reliable? You know, the New Testament in our Bible that we hold today, how do we know that it's reliable? We are going to be referring to the New Testament a lot throughout this course. And so we wanted to establish early on its reliability. So I think the two questions, and Frank Turek and Norman Geisler talk about these two questions in their book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. The two most important questions regarding our New Testament is, do we have accurate copies of the original documents that were written 2,000 years ago? And do those copies convey the truth? When they wrote down 2,000 years ago what happened, the events of Jesus living, were they telling the truth, right? And do we have accurate copies of what they wrote down? Meaning, is the Bible, the New Testament you're reading today, almost the same thing as you were reading it back in, say, the 1st century AD when it was written? So those are the two questions that you want to keep in the back of your mind as we're going through all of this. So what is the New Testament? Is it this book that God dropped out of the sky after Jesus rose from the dead? No, the New Testament is 27 different books, 27 books written on 27 different scrolls by 9 authors over a 20 to 50 year period in the 1st century AD. That's what the New Testament is. The 9 authors that wrote the New Testament are the Gospel writers: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Then we have Paul, Peter, Jude, the brother of Jesus, James, the brother of Jesus, and the writer of Hebrews, who nobody's really sure, as the 2nd century early church father Origen said, only God knows who wrote Hebrews. So maybe we'll know at one time, but we don't know today. Some people say Paul, some people say Apollos, Barnabas, etc., but there's no definitive answer as far as who wrote Hebrews. So those are the 9 authors of the 27 books. The Gospels are the first 4 books of the New Testament: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Okay, those are the Gospels. The dating for the 4 books of the Gospels are generally, Mark is the earliest Gospel, dated to around in the 50s AD. Some people even think the late 40s. Okay? And just keep in mind as we're going through this dating that Jesus died and rose from the dead in either AD 30 or AD 33. Okay? So if it's 33 AD and Mark is written in the late 40s or early 50s, you can see that's within, say, 15, 20 years of the events themselves. So Mark, Luke was written in the late 50s. Okay? Matthew was written maybe 60 AD, and then John was written, a lot of scholars say between 90 and 95 AD, although some point to the fact that the book of John doesn't mention the fall of Jerusalem, which happened in 70 AD, so potentially it hadn't happened yet, in which case John would be written earlier. But the consensus is that John was written about 90 to 95 AD. So who were the original gospel writers? Did they sign their names on their book like we see today? No, technically the original gospels were anonymous, okay? But we do have evidence that points to their authorship by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Papias said in AD 125 that Mark carefully and accurately recorded Peter's eyewitness observations. In fact, Papias said that Mark did not make any mistake and did not include any false statement. Papias also declared that Matthew preserved the teachings of Jesus as well. So Matthew and John were both part of the 12 disciples that Jesus chose. John was also part of the inner three, along with James, his brother, and Peter, that got to experience Jesus at an even closer angle, including the Transfiguration as well as other important moments. So what about Luke? Well, Irenaeus, writing in AD 180 in Adversus Hiereses, not sure if I said that right, 3.3.4, specifically confirms the authorship of Luke. He writes, Matthew published his own gospel among the Hebrews in their own tongue, while Peter and Paul were preaching the gospel in Rome and founding the church there. After their departure, Mark, the disciple and interpreter of Peter, himself handed down to us in writing the substance of Peter's preaching. Luke, the follower of Paul, set down in a book the gospel preached by his teacher. Then John, the disciple of the Lord, who also leaned on his breast, himself produced his gospel while he was living at Ephesus in Asia. So let's talk about the canon. So the canon is the 27 books of our New Testament. Now some people like to bring up other books and say, well, how come these books weren't included in the canon and these other books were? Is it some big conspiracy that was going on in the 4th century by Constantine in 325, and they made the whole movie about these other books? What was it? The Da Vinci Code, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip. What about these other Gnostic Gospels? Why weren't they included? Well, the bottom line is that these are later writings, okay? So all 27 books of the New Testament were written in the 1st century AD. These other so-called Gospels were not, okay? The Gospel of Thomas was written 2nd century AD, and these other Gospels, the so-called Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Philip, etc., these were written in the 3rd and 4th and even later centuries AD, way after the events themselves of the disciples walking with Jesus, of Jesus rising from the dead, etc. So, why would you prefer a 2nd, 3rd, or 4th century document over the 1st century documents of the New Testament? You wouldn't, right? The canon is a list of authoritative books rather than an authoritative list of books, meaning these books were already authoritative at the time that the canon was ratified as the canon of the New Testament. So the canon of the New Testament was put together in 363 in the Council of Laodicea, okay? So we have the events of Jesus in 30 or 33, and we have the Council of Laodicea in 363, right? So there's 330 years between the events and the official canon being said, hey, these are the books of the Christian church. Now, what happened in between that time? Well, if the books were written later, then we shouldn't be able to trust them. Like these books of the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Thomas, if they were written far after the lifetimes of the people who experienced those events, then we shouldn't be able to trust them. But all of the 27 books of the New Testament were written within the lifetimes of those people who actually experienced the events themselves. So they were all written in the 1st century AD. Well, how am I going to prove that? Watch more and you'll find out. Now, what I'd like to make a case for is what J. Warner Wallace made a case for, who's an apologist at coldcasechristianity.com, for a much earlier writing than what many claim of the Gospels. So J. Warner Wallace goes over, again, the events of Jesus, his public ministry, say between 30 and 33 AD, and the declaration of the canon in 363 AD at the Council of Laodicea. So it is interesting, you have the siege in Jerusalem in 69 AD. None of the Gospels mention this. Or the destruction of the temple in AD 70. None of the Gospels mention this. Even though it's mentioned in Matthew 23 when Jesus is referring to the temple. Don't you think that this would have been the perfect opportunity if Matthew had been written after AD 70 to say, well, that prophecy that Jesus said this temple will be destroyed actually came to fruition? Wouldn't Matthew have noted that the temple was destroyed? So the reason that it wasn't mentioned is because those books were written prior to the temple being destroyed in AD 70. Why is there no mention of Paul's death? People say between 64 and 67 AD. At the end of Acts, Paul is still alive. Why is there no mention of James's death in AD 61 or 62? Why is there no mention of Peter's death? There's no mention of these because these books were written prior to them happening, right? We know in the book of Acts that they mention James, the brother of John, dying. We know that they mention Stephen dying. Well, here's our three pillars, Peter, Paul, and James, the brother of Jesus. And they're not mentioned. Their deaths aren't mentioned. Again, they're not mentioned because they were written prior to those deaths happening. So the fact that they don't mention the death of James in, say, 61 or 62 AD means that it probably hadn't happened yet. So that would mean that we would place the book of Acts at, say, before 61. So let's just put it at 60, okay? Now, the book of Acts, we know, was the second book written by Luke. But there was a first book, right? The Gospel of Luke was written prior to 60. So that's why you have the writing, that's why you have the dating of Luke to be in the late 50s. Well, Wallace talks about actually putting it at 53 AD, the writing of Luke. Here's why. In 1 Timothy 5:17 through 18, Paul says this: "For the scripture says, 'Do not muzzle the ox while it is treading on the grain, and the worker deserves his wages.'" Now the first scripture, "Do not muzzle an ox while treading on a grain," is an Old Testament scripture. That's from Deuteronomy 25:4. But what about the second scripture? The worker is worthy of his wages. Well, that actually comes from Luke chapter 10, verse 6 through 7. So here we have Paul writing 1 Timothy in, say, between 63 and 64 AD, and he's quoting from what he calls scripture, which is Luke, and Paul should know what is or is not scripture. So he's quoting from the book of Luke there in 63, 64. So we know at least that Luke had been written by this time, 63 or 64 AD. But here we can go even earlier. So Paul quotes in 1 Corinthians 11:22 to 23, which 1 Corinthians was written between AD 53 and 57. Paul is quoting the Lord's Supper, and he uses the words, "Do this in remembrance of me." Again, he's writing this between 53 and 57. Well, where does this scripture come from? "Do this in remembrance of me." Well, it actually comes from Luke 22:19 through 20. So here we have Paul writing in between 53 and 57, and he is quoting from Luke, which obviously would have had to be written prior to 53 to 57. So that's where Wallace contends that you can put the writing of Luke, say around 53 or before that. The thing about Mark's gospel is that Mark's gospel was written before Luke's gospel. Papias tells us that Mark's gospel was an accurate account, but not necessarily an orderly account. And Luke, we see in Luke chapter 1, 1 through 4, that he says others have written an account of the events, but he wants to give an orderly account to Theophilus. So Luke's account is an accurate and orderly account. So we have Luke's gospel. Now Luke was not a disciple, but he was a historian. Okay, he is quoting from Mark. He pulls from Mark more than any other text. He quotes from Mark around 350 times. There's also 250 verses that appear in Luke that also appear in Matthew. So you could technically date Matthew earlier than Luke, although some would say that maybe Matthew took it from Luke's, and so I don't even want to get into that. But we do have an early dating, therefore, of Mark. So if Luke is written in 53 AD, and Luke is quoting from Mark, then that would put Mark, say, somewhere between 45 and 50 AD. Again, we're not saying that this proves that it is true, but it does prove that if they were liars, that they were early liars, okay? It was written early. That cannot be disputed. So that's the end of our first part. We will have more on the New Testament reliability next week. Hey, thanks so much for watching. If you have any questions or comments, you can leave them in the comments section. We'd be glad to answer them. And we'll see you in the next video.